To kick us into this next panel, Rajagopalan will moderate this panel on critical technologies, and I have to say from an ASPI perspective, a topic dear to our hearts, and a small plug for a initiative that we have, ongoing initiative that we call the Critical Tech Tracker. I encourage everybody to have a look and see the importance of research and development and time and effort and funding into critical technologies, both for domestic capacity and in terms of strategic competition. But I'm sure you are going to enjoy this panel on a very important topic. Raji, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin, and good morning, everyone. I think we've had a great start to the second day of the Raisina Down Under, and we're going to continue with that. So my name is Rajagopalan. I'm a resident senior fellow at the ASPI here, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel on critical technologies in the Indo-Pacific for the next, less than 50 minutes, I guess. So clearly there is a big push for new technologies. There is effort by every country, developed and developing countries, to acquire these technologies. So the key question is why this pursuit at this point of time that we see. Of course, they are important in the context of economic development, but also national security. The role that technology plays in the context of economic growth and development, augmenting competitiveness in sectors and ability to make effective decision, quicker decision in sectors like health, and of course the salience of technology in the context of national security. All of these are very, very critical. But while technology is an enabler for many developing countries, it is also at the center of the US-China rivalry and the strategic competition. And I think this is precisely this competition is because of the heavy dependence, the kind of reliance that we see, the kind of benefits that these technologies bring in, and therefore, whether it is in terms of upgrading your economy or it's your ability to enhance your military operations and so on and so forth in a more effective, seamless fashion. But the current trend wherein there is an integration of technologies into conventional military operations, with consequences for national security, cannot be and should not be stopped. It also means that the vulnerabilities and challenges that come along with it also goes manifold in the coming years. But this also brings in some of the issues around global tech governance. And I think there are questions are there any common standards, common principles that we can agree upon? And where is that conversation going to happen? Is it going to be at the United Nations? Will it continue to be the venue for these kind of conversations? Or are we going to take them to some of the unilateral platforms that are increasingly gaining salience in a sense? So that's one set of issues. But even when we talk about all of this competition and rivalry among the major powers, it's also kind of opening up opportunities for cooperation among like-minded countries. So again, something that we are going to be discussing in the next 45 minutes. So to take us through all of these issues, we have a fantastic panel who bring in diverse experience, expertise, and of course their own strength in addressing these tech-related issues. So I'm absolutely delighted to have all my four panelists here. Andrew Shearer, Director General, Office of National Intelligence, Australia. Mallory, Knodel, founder, Social Web Foundation, United States. And Anirban, Sarma, Deputy Director of ORF, Calcutta, India. And last but not the least, Yuka Koshino, Associate Fellow with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Japan. So let me start off with the one I think the most inevitable question. Great power today involves tech contests also. But how does that play out in a globalized world with globalized research, production, markets, and supply chains? Does one or the other need to be given up? And how does that really play out? Do we have to make a choice between great power contestation or the globalized world? Is there some way to maintain both of these? And I think especially this is going to be critical in time of during a conflict. So how do we go about it? Let me start with you, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Raji, and thank you to my old friends Justin and Samir. Both ASPI and, of course, ORF have made a massive contribution to the blossoming strategic partnership between Australia and India, and I'd like to associate myself with Minister Jaishankar's comments yesterday about the rude health that our partnership's in, but there's no cause for complacency. ONI exists to provide assessments to the Australian government on political and strategic and economic issues, and I have to say there's no shortage of business right now. There's a lot going on out in the world, and it's also our responsibility to provide assessments on the impact of those trends when they come onshore in Australia, and of course technology is right at the centre of that. We're dealing with multiple concurrent interacting crises at the moment across the world. Think about climate change, the energy transition, food and energy insecurity issues. The list is almost endless. And onshore, developed countries like Australia are grappling with ageing societies, low productivity growth, a whole range of challenges, and an increasingly fractious, fragmented social and political environment, which makes political decision-making more difficult. In that context, I think the largest driver of strategic change is geopolitical rivalry and the re-emergence of geopolitics and its interaction with economics. That's absolutely fundamental to many of the challenges that Australia is facing in our region, globally, and also at home. And we are grappling to deal with those changes. Right at the heart of that geopolitical contest is advanced technology and the battle for advanced technology. Sometimes I call it the centre of gravity, because I'm a strategic analyst at heart, but also the commanding heights, because technology is the main driver of national power. It's the main creator of economic power and of military power, and therefore the country or countries that are able to dominate advanced technology now and in the future are best placed ultimately to come out on top in what I think will be a generational structural contest in the Indo-Pacific and globally, and the Indo-Pacific contest I think will be determinative of the overall global contest. That's very challenging for governments.
Yeah.
Technology offers massive advantages. We're all very focused on how we can optimise the benefits of AI while mitigating the risks. We're not going to eradicate them. I'm sure the panel will talk more about that. But quantum, biotech, I mean, these domains of advanced technology will be crucial. And our assessment is that because this strategic competition, particularly between China and its band of Axis powers and the United States and its band of democratic allies, and it's great to be on a quad panel up here,
Yeah.
feel right at home. Advanced technology will be critical to how this contest plays out. We're already seeing fragmentation globally around technology. Our assessment is that because the strategic rivalry will continue, the contest for technology will only intensify. We've seen that in the advanced semiconductor measures put in place by the United States. They've just announced more measures to do with outbound investment, including around advanced semiconductor technology. So that will continue in our assessment, and we are facing, sadly, for those of us who lived through and benefited so greatly from the period of globalisation, it will mean a more fragmented, higher cost, higher inflation, and less open global economy, but also S&T sector. That's regrettable, but it's a reality. Just a couple of final points. One change that we as governments are grappling with is that traditionally most of the technology was generated by us, for us, and then made its way into the private economy. Of course, today the roles are completely reversed, and almost all technology is dual use. the internet was developed, as everyone knows, by DARPA and then became the internet. But today, we are grappling to keep up with technological development, some of them disruptive, led by the private sector, often without much regulation. Regulation struggles to keep up. I'm sure that will be a theme. What this means, and I'm going to finish on this note, and I noticed that the last panel talked about this, is that partnerships and coalitions between groups of like-minded countries, which I would argue have always been important, as a avid activist both for the Quad and AUKUS, are going to become more central, whether it's around critical minerals, which I know the last panel discussed, around all sorts of other areas of advanced technology. And that's going to manifest more strongly, and I think we will see further fragmentation, as I said, around that. And then finally, I'm often surprised how much time I spend talking to Australian business leaders and the leaders of our tech sector and our higher educational institutions. And that's going to be critical because I can't protect our critical infrastructure, our critical networks, our ICT systems. Only the private sector can do that. But we need genuine, trusted partnerships across the economy if we're to be successful ultimately in this contest. And just to finish on a note of optimism, because I'm usually called, including by the Prime Minister, his bad news guy, I am optimistic. I think these partnerships are an area of massive strategic advantage for all of the countries represented up here. And I think there's huge opportunity and huge agency, and we have to embrace the opportunities posed by technology. We can't be defensive. We can't try to shut it all down. We've got to mitigate the risk, but we've got to lean into it. I'll leave it there.
Perfect. I will come back to some of the points. I think there were several spin-off points from that. But let me take it to Mallory. How do you look at some of these emerging issues and this whole technology rivalry among the major powers? But it's also kind of beginning to move down the chain to other countries. So there are groups of countries coming together. But overall, if you can give us your sense of.
For sure, yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you all. It's always a great pleasure to talk about this. So I'm a technologist, and I spend a lot of time in the details of how the internet works, how digital technologies are designed, developed, and deployed. And I think it's an interesting, if not just useful, vantage point to look at some of these questions. And I will say that, in my view, the internet is really unique. Digital technologies are unique, not just because of the really interesting, in my view, ways that they've been designed, but the way that they're governed. So somebody who has written on how the internet works, I can tell you it's not just about the technology, it's very, very much about the cooperation required to keep a global communication system operating. That and the governance then structures that follow from that are, I think, one of the biggest innovations of humanity, not the technology itself. And I think that this speaks to the question at hand, because when I hear discussions about control or fight for control or things like that, all I can think of is that when you have governments fighting for control against one another, or governments versus corporations, which we're seeing a lot more as well globally, the folks who lose out is everyone who's online and using it. The folks who lose out are citizens. And it's also not healthy for the internet. The word fragmentation's already been used. That, I think, is quite a risk. And it's kind of antithetical to the way the internet's designed. So it's not a question of our control versus their control. It's a question of control or not control. Cooperation, I think, is the antidote here. So let me just think through out loud, why I think states need to be involved. So as I've sort of said, the internet's very cooperative in its nature. It requires every single country on Earth to adopt the same kinds of standards, to implement the technologies through private sector incentives, through economic health, and sustainability, everyone is involved, right? I'm actually from civil society. I work for nonprofit organizations. I always have my whole career. I'm a technologist sort of working in that interest, but then obviously you have corporations and you have countries. Countries have a really particular role to play, even though the whole landscape is very, as we say, multi-stakeholder. Because countries have control, or they have obligations and responsibilities that are very different than all the other stakeholder groups, right? For example, the human rights obligations are on countries, and now companies have responsibilities, and obviously civil society cares a lot about human rights. The organizations I've worked for have been human rights organizations that are very much watchdogging and care about human rights. But states have that as their main obligation. Everyone has signed the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. A few things that we've seen in global internet governance in the last year or so come to light. I like to think of them in 4 buckets. One is around censorship and shutdowns. Only really states are doing that. There's not really corporate incentive to shut down the internet or to censor it on a massive scale. So that, I think, requires states to exercise restraint mostly and care around that. Second is access to the internet, helping to extend it, and that again is a cooperative issue. We heard yesterday about this reframe from cooperation to de-conflicting. I like that reframe, but I think there is, in the case of digital technologies, a real requirement to have actual cooperation, because you are literally connecting across borders and so on. So access is still a problem and something only really states can solve. Weapons in war, another one. Not really in the purview of the private sector, not really in the purview of CSOs. Weapons in war is not yet confronted, I think, at the digital level in the way that digital technologies are implicated now in almost all conflict. That, I don't think, gets the attention it really should. And then a sort of similar one, maybe it's a subset of the third one, is this notion of I know we talk about state sovereignty, but I think we don't also talk enough about what it means to be online as a human being, and things like having access to quality internet, but also in a way that is private and rights respecting, does require some use of technology such as encryption that again continues to come up over and over again when states are struggling for power. They tend to look at some of these technologies. So I guess I will also just say that I think for CSOs, it's very important to partner with states in holding corporations accountable. I think the centralization of the internet by only a few large corporations is also very detrimental to the internet, and it's detrimental to global cooperation. And states really have the power and the control to start regulating that. And in cooperation with civil society sector, I think that is an important thing to do. So I would say that the message I want to leave you with is that it is working. I know we feel like there are all these omni-crises happening and so on, but the internet itself and the way that it's been governed, the way that it is to the point where it is now, even under these new regulatory regimes that seem a little uncertain, are they really going to work? Is this going to get fragmented? It's all working the way that it should. We're all participating in the governance of the internet, and it's still on. Even when you have this massive rivalry between the US and China, they're still coming to the standards bodies that I work in. Everyone is now in Dublin for the Internet Engineering Task Force. I'm here with you all. And you have as many folks from Huawei and Chinese companies as you do from European and US companies. And while we feel that our geopolitical conversations may be fragmented and broken, the technical standards conversations are still working.
Again, a lot of keywords from both of you, but let me just finish. If you can move to Anirban, if you can share some thoughts on some of these key issues.
All right. Thank you so much, Raji, and a very good morning to my fellow panelists and to other colleagues here in the auditorium. In some of our informal conversations leading up to the panel, we've been talking about the need to create a bubble of technological trust with friends in the Indo-Pacific. And this is important because it seems to me that the Quad has been doing a pretty good job of being able to build this trusted space, within the Indo-Pacific. And a little over a month ago, of course, the Quad leaders held their 4th summit. It was very productive. There was a flurry of joint statements, media releases, etc. And many of these drew attention to a spectrum of initiatives in the critical and emerging technology space, like it has in the 4 years before. And it's quite amazing to see the progress that has been made. And what's important here is that these are initiatives that benefit not just the Quad partners themselves, but clearly the larger Indo-Pacific in a very strong way. So if you take ORAN, for example, the Quad's Open RAN work began as a pilot project with a certain small island developing state in the Indo-Pacific. But today that has been upscaled into a full-blown regional ORAN cooperation. More trials are being held in the field, and there's also pretty large-scale workforce initiatives. ORAN workforces are being trained in partnership with institutions in India, and this is meant to serve all of South and Southeast Asia. AI, of course, the focus on AI keeps growing every year, and it's interesting that the security-focused moorings of the Quad are moving into slightly broader fields now. So AI Engage, which is this big initiative to empower farmers and agricultural research in AI, that's been a major focus of the Quad in the last year, all right? Nothing to do with security, but it shows how the Quad is moving into newer and newer directions. But of course, some of the older priorities remain, so there's a lot of focus on the interoperability of AI governance frameworks, for example. We need more international cooperation on AI systems. That continues. Another point of importance and priority for the Quad is the issue of resilience in semiconductor supply chains. This is obviously a key issue. China is a threat, but which is why the Quad countries came together and signed this memorandum of cooperation to set up a semiconductor supply chain contingency network. All right, another classic example of something that is going to benefit the Indo-Pacific as a whole. And the last example I want to give is the Quad Investors Network. This was set up in 2023, and it's gained quite a lot of traction since. And it's playing a pretty key role in bringing private investors, corporations, public institutions together and building these public-private partnerships which are going to serve the region as a whole. And over the last year, they've managed to make 10 major investments in the region, which are going to have pretty wide-ranging benefits. Now, we also heard Dr. Joyshankar talk yesterday about how the strength of the minilateral, how the strength of the Quad is also in large part being driven by the strength of bilateral relationships within the Quad. And I think there's a lot of reason for optimism here. If you look at the bilateral relationships India itself shares with other Quad countries, the most prominent of these, of course, is the ISET. And this is extraordinary because of the momentum it's managed to generate in just a year and a half, and also the sheer breadth of areas it touches upon. But then we have equally prominent relationships with Japan. Since 2022, that was when Japan and India signed this semiconductor agreement, all right? So we're cooperating in a number of R&D related fields, development, manufacturing, etc. And we also have with Japan an emerging technologies initiative, which is working with startups, innovators across the field. And of course, coming to Australia, our host country today, we've just entered into the 4th round of the Australia-India Cyber and Critical Technologies Partnership, which again is pooling trust, pooling resources, knowledge, building trust between these two countries. So there's a lot happening, both at the minilateral level and at the sort of bilateral level. But what's kind of important through all of this is that, these are on the face of it government-to-government partnerships. But then that's a little misleading because each time Quad nations enter into a partnership of any kind, it's really two whole ecosystems of private players, research institutions, academia, all coming together. The days of government-led technology development are long over, right? So there's a whole web of partnerships, trust-based commercial relationships that come into play when these relationships are built. And I think semiconductors, which I've spoken about a couple of times, are probably the best example of this because the semiconductor supply chain is such, a semiconductor and its parts travel across 70 borders on average before they reach the end user. All right, so that gives us an idea of the sheer web and complexity of these relationships, that are built when technology partnerships are built. So I'll end my opening remarks with that.
Sure.
And,
thank you. Let me come to Yuka. Your thoughts on these emerging tech issues and policy issues in a sense. And I think you will be able to bring in diverse perspectives, so keen to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you so much, Raji. And thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this conference and also to join this distinguished group of experts and practitioners. So I think I would like to dive into the topic of cooperation, technology cooperation among like-minded partners, because when we start talking about the great power competition and also the need for like-minded partners to cooperate to develop a secure, open, and more accessible technology, the theme has already been there for some time now. For instance, when we talked a lot about the Quad, the panelists talked a lot about the Quad, but the working group for critical and emerging technology was developed in March 2021. And when we start looking at the bilateral discussions on technology cooperation, it precedes the Quad initiatives. I've been engaging with this policy debate, first as a think tank scholar and also recently from a venture capitalist community as well. So I would like to observe where we are now, so more of like how far we are in this tech cooperation and what more we need to do to advance this and to achieve the goal. So I'd like to talk in three parts. So first, the first phase is really the adoption of basic economic security measures by this innovation and technology ecosystem since around 2017. So the major drivers were, of course, partly because the fourth industrial revolution and its outcomes like AI, 5G, or quantum, biotech, all has dual-use application, as Andrew mentioned. But also the over-reliance on one country, China, has geoeconomic and strategic consequences. And of course, the pandemic really revealed that the supply chain of these strategic goods could be significantly disrupted or could be in a crisis. And so these were really like the wake-up calls for countries to adopt these measures, including strengthening export control or FDI screening, or talk about research integrity, or even boosting R&D and supply and subsidies to grow these technologies as well, and to develop a diverse supply chain for these technologies. And of course, not only that, but discussing economic security issues among partners has become a norm or like a regular thing, even in bilateral level, trilateral, plurilateral, and multilaterals. And I think Japan, as a country that has been working on economic security from the early 2000s, as Mr. Maeda alluded in the last panel, has been driving this international cooperation as well. And almost happening simultaneously is the second phase, which I would say is more of a domestic initiative, but about expanding the government's capacity to engage with the diverse actors in this technology ecosystem, including the university labs or startup CEOs or companies or financial institutions, to prevent the technology outflow or to innovate faster than our strategic competitors, and also to bring these advanced technology to the militaries as the governments prepare to deter and respond to a potential major contingency in the region as well. So governments have been kind of experimenting many different ways. So the early, for instance, model would be the Pentagon's initiative, like the creation of the DIU-X in 2015, which has now been leveraged into DIU and directly reporting to the Secretary of Defense to really adopt the commercial solutions for defense. But in the economic security civilians field, for instance, Japan set up the world's first ever economic security minister post to really coordinate better across the government to protect and promote critical technologies. But of course, in many countries, even in these two countries, governments are still working in silos, and also the cultural differences between the private sector and the government has been major obstacles for this effort. And then the final phase, where we are now, we're seeing greater demand and opportunities to integrate this technology and innovation ecosystem among the US allies and partners to serve as a force multiplier in the great power competition. So early examples of practical initiatives include, for instance, in 2021, we saw the setting up of the Quad STEM Fellowship, which is the effort to network the technologists and scientists among the Quad countries and bring them and sponsor them to study in the US on STEM and STEM field. And we recently expanded that to include ASEAN countries as well. And then the second example is the Quinn that the panelists alluded to really help bridge the resource and the startup, bring the resources mobilize the resources among the partners and then to bring to the startup ecosystems. And then we're also seeing greater integration in the defense innovation area as well. So AUKUS Pillar 2 is a notable example of advanced technology collaboration among the most trusted partners between UK, Australia, and the US. But also at the bilateral level, US and India has also launched the Indus-X, which is to try to work together and partner among the defense ecosystem. Most recently, DIU and Japan's newly established DISDI, so it's the Defense Innovation Science and Technology Institute. It's kind of like a Japanese version of DIU, but for instance, one of the project managers is from DARPA, for instance, and there has been efforts to embed each other's personnel to really understand each other's ecosystem. So while these initiatives are, of course, great to begin with, of course, making them actually work is still very challenging. For instance, there is still gaps in technological capabilities, or even organizational capacities, and also information gap is really essential so that we don't have missed opportunities or we don't have uneven outcomes among the partners. And then also still there's the issue of trust among even the closest partners as well, largely because of the differences in cultures and languages that each governments operate. So what this all means is that we also need to really look and invest in developing and strengthening the foundations for this interoperable ecosystem, which is really the basic thing to understand better and learn better about each other's ecosystem and how it works at the ground level. So I think there's a lot of government role that would play into that.
Terrific. I want to go to the audience for a couple of questions at least, but I'm very, very tempted to ask one round of quick question because I think you did talk about, Andrew, you talked about the dual use being an issue, and I think that goes for every single technology that we're talking about. You talked about access, you talked about engaging with the industry and other stakeholders and so on and so forth. So I think, and also you talked about brought in the export control element into the conversation. So the one key question is, what is going to be the effectiveness of export controls? Are we going to be able to establish some of the export controls as we did see during the Cold War? But during those years, those few decades, the kind of linkages that existed between the major powers were very, very limited. So it was easier said than done, easier at that time. Today, given the kind of linkages that we see and the permeated role of technology in every sphere, how do you see many of these dual-use technologies being controlled through effective export control mechanisms or other rules and regulations? Also, a related question is, how do you bring in, because given that technology is used by every single player today, how do you bring in the smaller countries to have a voice in this kind of a role? And also the private sector, what kind of a role can they play in shaping effective export controls, standards, guidelines, and so on and so forth in governing this particular in this sector in a sense? Do you want to start us off? Yeah?
Sure. I guess I'll touch on 3 points. So on export controls, I think it's still early stages. So as I mentioned, countries have adopted and strengthened these measures, but it's really difficult to assess the impact of it. And also, secondly, technology control is, of course, not perfect. And even during the Cold War, and even the most sensitive technologies like nuclear technologies have been flowed into the Soviet Union back then, and even there were some, the COCOM export control system also still has some loopholes. So it's always not perfect, and the challenge is bigger today because, as I mentioned, private sector is involved and there's diverse actors. But then I think what we're seeing is that the efforts to develop a trusted network of partners. Yep. I think when we talk about export control, we also need to think about how can we ease the export control among the like-minded partners so that we can innovate together and we can integrate, mobilize the resources, as the external minister has mentioned. And then finally, on the role of smaller countries, and I think the differences between the Cold War and today is that during the Cold War, the superpowers were dominating the technology competition. So of course, the partners were involved in the R&D, but US is essentially leading and dominating the technologies. But today, the situation is different. And US government officials have acknowledged that they need the partners to really make sure that the US and like-minded partners have the competitive edge of technologies. So that's why we have seen all these initiatives to try to link up the different sectors and different dimensions to develop the ecosystem. So I would say that countries have a role to leverage these strategic developments and cooperation and frameworks to really channel the resources to develop the domestic technological capabilities that would ultimately contribute to the force multiplier piece that I was talking about.
Perfect. Andrew, some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I totally agree. Just a few additional points. I mean, on removing barriers between allies and like-minded is absolutely essential, and really that idea is at the heart of AUKUS, and the legislation passed by the US Congress is going to be really important because it's all about reducing those barriers. And, you know, I've been working on and off for 30 years on that issue. It's a pretty hard nut to crack. But I think what's changed is the United States and its allies realise that we are really up against it in this international competition. I want to turn here to the Axis powers that I mentioned before. And export controls are very relevant here. We're dealing with a much more interconnected world, and therefore export controls are much more complex, and they're more complex because of the inherently dual nature of much of this technology. But that means we have to work harder, not sort of give up, in my view. And we've got to make sure that not only export controls, but foreign investment regimes, the sorts of visas that are granted to researchers at our higher educational institutions, and a whole range of other measures are in place so that there's full alignment in all of those different measures, because our adversaries are very adept at finding ways through our different regimes. And if they find one particular country too hard to crack, they will go to another one. They will make increasing use of front companies and different types of corporate structures. This is very challenging work. Our intelligence agencies are working much more closely with our Treasury and other economic departments in the Australian system, and we're working much more closely with our partners here. And then just finally, on the Axis countries, my own very strong view is that we have underestimated the strategic impact that this emerging axis that has really the China-Russia friendship without limits at its absolute core, the massive provision by China of dual-use assistance to Putin and economic support and diplomatic support is keeping Putin's army in the field in Ukraine, killing innocent Ukrainians just as surely as if they were providing artillery, ammunition and missiles. And we have to do a better job of disrupting these burgeoning networks, the provision of Iranian drones, the provision of North Korean missiles, artillery ammunition, and now even combat troops in Europe. This is a profoundly troubling strategic development, and we are all grappling to catch up with it and put in place effective measures. But I think this is one of the strategic challenges of our time.
Absolutely. Do you have some specific thoughts on this? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Let me tell a quick story that's a bit on the nose for today. So related to export controls and other kinds of trade protectionism, Trump tried to ban certain Chinese technologies. We all remember that, right? One of the things that got swept up in that executive order was the IEEE, which is a standards body that deals with hardware. So it's the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And they overnight, in response to that Bureau of Commerce rule that came from the executive order, they overnight removed any chair of a group that was from China. And then the next day, everyone ran down to downtown DC to the White House to try to get them to relax that because they were so worried that it would, separate these conversations. We actually really need, China and its manufacturing and its hardware to be in conversation with the rest of the global standards community. So this kind of goes back to my original point, but I think it's an example of how it failed, and it could have been disastrous, but in fact it wasn't. I do think, though, there are some caveats to what I've been saying about how standards or global internet governance in a multi-stakeholder way are a real solution here. The caveats are this: there are not enough countries. Very few countries have the capacity to participate at a deep level. There's a lot of meetings every year. They change location. It's not just Geneva and New York. You have to have a lot of technical depth to follow the conversations. And we only have a handful of big dominant countries, and that's not enough. And I think there's an antidote to that, which is almost every country, right, has its own national standards bodies. You start locally, you build the capacity into regional participation, and then that goes up to the global level. And any small country can do that and should think about strategically participating there. The other caveat is that I was speaking before about how our political conversations are fraught, the technical conversations are not as fraught. That is not always true, but it's also not always great, because I think that technocratizing every conversation really isn't necessarily the answer, right? There's a reason why Russia and China are really excited to participate in the ITU. They would love to turn all sort of social problems into technical problems. And so I think we do have to be aware that there is a bit that gets lost when we just speak in terms of the technology rather than the real sort of material social impacts of these things. So with those caveats, though, I will still push for greater participation in these global governance spaces, because that is really what makes not just the internet work, but sort of all of the other wonderful outcomes that the internet affords work as well.
Anirban, do you want to come right now, or should we take a quick round of questions and then?
Okay, sure.
Okay, let's just get a couple of questions at least from the floor, and then okay, there's one here, the mic will reach you just now. Table 7. Thanks.
Thank you. I was wondering, how do we practically balance the need for national security versus the desire for greater collaboration? Security requirements are, quite rightly, getting higher and higher and higher, yet there's a growing demand for greater collaboration between our countries, for sharing resources, particularly when it comes to people with technology capabilities and sharing them between our countries. Yeah. It is a fundamental challenge, but how do we address that?
Okay, is there another question from the floor? If there is one more question, then we will take it together. Yes.
Hi, this is Pulkit Arthavle from the University of Sydney. I had a question about digital ID in specific, because we do know that there are benefits to digitalizing ID, but there are obviously security risks as well. And increasingly, social media companies also ask for, government ID as a form of verification, which poses its own risks. Recently, Australia has proposed a trust exchange model of token-based identity verification, and it's something I've been interested in because I've written about token-based, kind of novel identity verification methods. So 2 kind of questions on the security aspect of it. One, for a token-based system, what do you think about the risks as well as the practicability of a centralized versus decentralized model? And secondly, what about the risks of private social media companies getting digital ID information, whether it's, TikTok or Meta and so on? Thank you.
Anirban, would you want to take the digital ID question? And Andrew, since it is also to do with the Australia stuff, maybe you can also do it.
I can actually.
Otherwise, the question on the economic, balancing between economic interests, collaboration, and national security. Yeah.
I think I could try and take a stab at the first question about shared security challenges and how to address them. Very pertinent question. And let's take cyber attacks, for example. Right? Cyber attacks have been growing exponentially across the world since 2020, and last year alone, they doubled. And within the Quad, we see a mirroring of these trends. Cyber attacks have gone up. This is a shared security challenge for all the Quad countries. But how do they respond to it? Now, of course, each of the 4 countries have come up with their own unique policy approaches, right? We all have our own cyber laws and frameworks and regulations, et cetera. And that works for individual countries. But the thing is, when you're dealing with a group, when you're dealing with a grouping of like-minded countries, it could get in the way of a whole-of-Quad approach, all right? And that has been happening. I mean, India doesn't quite have a national cybersecurity strategy or framework yet, though we have a number of organs that deal with cyber attacks. The US put its cyber strategy framework in place last year. The other countries have also had theirs since 2021 or so. So, in situations like this, what might help is to work towards some amount of regulatory alignment within a small group of countries. And there are some potential benefits of this. For example, this could reduce the complexity of operations and even of compliance for tech companies which work across multiple jurisdictions, for example. All right, also consider the reduced burden on governments and administrative agencies which deal with cyber attacks. It's actually much easier if there's a streamlined reporting mechanism, if you actually have shareable mechanisms for cyber incident reporting, common definitions around critical infrastructure protection, et cetera, right? So some amount of alignment could be worked towards within groupings like the Quad. There are also greater cost efficiencies to be achieved here. There could be a pooling of financial, technological, and human resources. The Quad has always been pretty big on the idea of joint capacity building. Now, if you have laws which align with each other, regulations that align with each other, it's actually possible to design more focused and targeted capacity building programs as well, right? And of course, all of this leads to a kind of pooled knowledge and improved trust within these little groups of like-minded countries. So that is one way in which, in respect to cybersecurity in particular, a small group of countries can actually work and address a shared security challenge, right? I'll just end with that, yeah.
Yuka, do you want to address any other questions?
Sure. Maybe just a very quick point about balancing security and then also cooperation. I think it also comes to which segment and which part of the supply chain that we really want to address security. So for instance, at the basic scientific research collaboration level, it's quite difficult to fragment, and we've already seen that, for instance, Nature has an index about collaboration on AI, and we're seeing a lot of collaboration on papers with even US and Chinese partners. But then I think where we really need the security element is the application side, so, and then the commercialization effort. So if we're talking about commercialization in the digital critical infrastructure, of course we need to fold in security elements and have tighter requirements. And of course, if we want to develop dual-use technologies potentially for defense application, of course, that should be developed between trusted partners. So I think choosing the right part of the supply chain is really key to balance.
Okay, on that note, unless there are any pressing comments, the time's up, so we're going to stop here. But I think we are going to continue this conversation over lunch in the meantime. And thank you so much for really insightful comments and thoughts shared during this panel. Please join in giving a hand of applause to the panelists, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji and panel.